All right, here we go. So for kinesiology 231, this is module 5, specific to muscular strength, muscular power, and muscular endurance testing. The book lists 2 different exercises for strength, 3 different exercises for power, and 3 different exercises for muscular endurance testing. I want to take a moment and just kind of compare and contrast aerobic versus anaerobic and strength versus power. These are things you should already know, but it can't hurt to go ahead and refresh on these and take a look. So if we look at this, this is a pretty well-known concept where you have the sport event on one line, and then you have the energy system, the main rep range, the duration of time for the actual activity itself. Now, granted, Olympic weightlifting is in fractions of a second, 100 meters, 10 seconds. You get over here to aerobic, and that's 10,000 meters. You're talking 20 minutes. And usually when you look at this, I mean, granted, these guys are flying anyways, but usually we would associate that as fat as a predominant energy source, and then glycogen or carbohydrate being a predominant energy source over here. So from a training standpoint, you normally would have your rep range for the folks that are down in this end be in this lower rep range, and folks over here would be in a higher rep range to match the sport energy demands. Now, here's the thing. There's a specificity in training that we have for athletics, and there's a specificity in training that we have with our clients as well, and that's a little bit different, but with like a sport activity, it's pretty absolute, right? You got to train a certain way so you get a certain result for your sport. And with training the general population for fitness to get into a wedding dress or go on a vacation, you can do any number of different modalities or protocols to suit your purposes. But again, if you're somebody who is a distance runner and you're doing heavy power cleans, or you're somebody who is an Olympic weightlifter and your coach is asking you to go out and run a 5K, you're probably being done a disservice. So with that stated, the way I always describe kind of the combination between aerobic and anaerobic is this. You have the sprinter and the couch spud. And so on TV, you have somebody who's about ready to run a 100-meter race. Meanwhile, there's a person at home sitting on the couch watching the race on TV. If you think about the two of them, you have two predominant energy systems at work, one of which is a fat-burning energy system, and the other is glycogen, or carbohydrates, depending on how you want to say it. I'll use those two interchangeably. So the person who is sitting on the couch is very much in the aerobic side of it. I mean, perhaps 90-something% fat burn. And then when you go over to the anaerobic side, that person is very much carbohydrate or glycogen being used as a fuel source. But the thing is, when you look at these two, it doesn't quite give the full representation of what's going on. When we look at this and you go ahead and go, all right, on the pie chart of working out and fitness, the anaerobic side, the sprinter, yes, of course, his fat burn is a very small percentage, maybe 10% for sake of our conversation here, but he is burning calories at a higher rate per minute than the person sitting on the couch. So even though this person is burning more fat, his pie is very small, although it's predominantly fat burn. So when you start to talk with clients about like that sweet spot with working out, we look at it in terms of, we try to take people like I do, anaerobic threshold right on the cusp where we have the highest caloric burn, and we're still utilizing the fat source as an energy, and we're not dipping too far into the glycogen. Now, granted, we go ahead and we push people over that threshold and pull them back, but what we really try to do here is take people at the greatest caloric burn rate, and you look at this and go, okay, the greatest caloric burn rate is when you have somebody who's anaerobic and sprinting at a high rate of speed versus somebody who's sitting on a couch. Pretty absolute, I understand, but it really paints the picture in terms of energy system and caloric burn. So now this becomes important, right? When you look at like what you're trying to accomplish. We've talked about general adaptation syndrome. I know you have in your classes. The bell curve is that bell curve of wellness I talked about before, with like 67% of the clients are looking to burn fat and get in shape. So there's a balance between these two, right? You're not going to have your people do 100-meter sprints all the time, and you're not going to have people sit on the couch. So you have to find the balance between the aerobic and the anaerobic. And usually your balance is this, right? You have the bigger caloric burn, And you come down here, you add that to the idea of you're going to run right along the anaerobic threshold, and you're going to do so the biggest caloric burn at the highest fat burn rate. Now, granted, this is just for visual, but you look for like this type of ratio, the biggest burn at the biggest percentage fat. So it's kind of like the bang for the buck thing, right? When you work with your clients. And believe me, this is an uncomfortable place to be. And it's an uncomfortable place to work. I mean, if you're somebody who's been an athlete and you've worked at high levels, you know this space, especially if you're somebody who ran track and ran 400. Oof, man, you know it. Or we're in a sport that required this type of activity where you were at or over anaerobic threshold many different times in a game. But for the layperson, this is challenging. And this becomes a conversation of now, how do you take people past this anaerobic threshold, take them from where they are in this aerobic state to anaerobic state? How do you get them to have a little bit more work, if you will? And when you look at this, when you talk with your clients, there's a real simple conversation regarding that kind of oxygen allocation, where at 80%, you can either have a conversation with me or you can have oxygen for your muscles. Take your pick. And usually the conversation drops out at about 80%. And so with that, you take it a little bit further. If you want to look up the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, you could do that. It's a good conversation. Usually it takes like about half a class for me to explain it. But you'll look at this in terms of how the body responds to exercise. And where this takes us is into a conversation of strength versus power. Now, this is where we'll spend a lot of our time in this presentation. We talked about work previously. We talked about work in another presentation in terms of reps and sets and quantifying work. And we quantified it a step further with volume load and how you can quantify out how many reps, how many sets, and how much weight is pushed over the course of maybe 30 reps, and it became 2,100 pounds if a person was doing 70 pounds per rep. So now you start to look at this in terms of, and I brought this up regarding the power clean. The power clean is a power-oriented exercise, so the workloads are different because of the power component. And the way I always like to describe this is, on the strength side, if I am asked to push a boulder across the floor, I can push that boulder right across the floor, and that's work. We can quantify that in terms of weight of boulder, the friction on the boulder, how smooth it is, how flat the surface, and how far we're pushing. All right. So when you say push the boulder across the floor, that's work. But as soon as you say push the boulder up a hill, that's more work. If we have a heavier boulder, that's more work. Now, if we go ahead and do the same thing, same boulder, and now you ask me to push the boulder faster, now we have a time component. And that is where it becomes power oriented. So you can have the same weight boulder, the same distance, but now you're asked to push it for a faster time. You are now increasing the power demands and the power loading in that equation. And as a result, when you look at it in terms of work, there's the power component that sometimes is missed when you start talking with your clients about their exercise. So the big thing, like here, you got the graphic or the visual interpretation of pushing that boulder up a hill. Now, as soon as I ask this gentleman to push that boulder up the hill in as short amount of time as possible, that now increases the power parameters. And that's the same thing when you go from a deadlift to a hang clean, or a deadlift to a high pull, or a deadlift to a power clean. You're going from something that is not power oriented, it's very strength oriented. And as soon as you bring in the component of time, then it becomes power oriented. So power cleans themselves are usually done in a fraction of the amount of time as a deadlift. And there's a power curve that happens when you go from first pull to second pull and accelerate the hips. But the important part of that is, as we increase in the component of time and make that more and more constraint, you have a greater necessity to have better and better technique and greater proficiency in technique to be able to perform that exercise. So if we just look at these simple examples, a push press and a dumbbell shoulder press. For one, you're using the hips to accelerate. They're going to dip down, accelerate up. So that dip and drive is a counter movement, and that counter movement preloads the muscles, and there's an acceleration curve as a person explodes the weight up to the ceiling. Now with this one, this is a seated shoulder press, and I'll notice this one, there is some shoulder work involved, but it's not the same as this. And notice the timing on this. A little bit slower in terms of timing. This has more of a pop as you go up to the ceiling, whereas this one, you could do as slow as you want. You can make that time under tension multiple seconds if you so choose. But this, because it's power oriented, you cannot. So as we look at these tests, you have to look at these tests and start to really evaluate what's going on with each one of them. Hang cleans from a box or leg press. So you have very power oriented movement here. Snap the hips. Snap the hips. Over here, same thing with our shoulder press like we did before. You can go ahead and do this as fast or as slow as you want, but usually with this type of tempo, while we are doing a quad exercise, there's a little bit of glute, maybe a little smidge of hamstring in there as well. It is not as power oriented as this. So when you start looking at these tests, realize that you're looking at this in terms of where does this test fall in here? Obviously it's strength oriented, so it's going to be the 1 and 2 rep range, but you're really focusing on this kind of concept of strength versus power. And you'll see with some of these tests now, when you look at like the maximum leg press and you look at some of the other ones that we have for muscular power, you'll notice the difference in terms of the explosiveness for each.